A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. Makalanaki. A new episode every single day. Episode 24. Thebes, Twin Sovereigns of the Chessboard. Decurchus Drilling Grounds, Thebes, Spring. The colossal sculpture known as history occasionally sharpens its most cold and beautiful blades within the darkest mire, at the very bottom of humiliation. In the early 4th century BCE, the whole of Greece was confined within a massive rigid cage of muscle, bearing the name of Sparta, stifling the breath of the populace. The ancient city of Thebes, ensconced upon the fertile plains of Boeotia, was likewise trampled beneath those iron military boots, groaning under the ultimate indignity of a Spartan garrison occupying its proud citadel, the Cadmea. Yet, the true awakening of the spirit is invariably prepared at the absolute floor of the night. The geostrategic trajectory of beauty, through which the unyielding soul of Thebes severed the Spartan iron chains and ascended to the apex of Greece, was consummated by 3 mathematical sequences. 1. Flight of the night, the liberation of the Cadmea, 379 BCE. The first minor spark was birthed from a turbid mixture of jet-black night and fresh blood. On a winter night, when the traders of Thebes, who had transformed into the puppets and surrogates of Sparta, abandoned themselves to wine and the flesh of women, Pelopidas and a handful of patriots who had infiltrated from their place of exile burst into the banquet disguised in female attire. With short daggers concealed beneath their garments, they pierced the brains of the traders who were lusting after beautiful flesh, killing them in a single stroke. At dawn, the citizenry rose in revolt and expelled the besieged Spartan soldiers. The citadel of the Cadmea was solemnly reclaimed by the rigorous hands of the Thebans. This was no mere coup d'état. It was the first definitive laceration carved into the physical myth of Spartan invincibility. 2. Incarnation of philosophy, the creation of the oblique phalanx, 371 BCE, the Battle of Leuctra. However, the true geostrategic pivot was brought forth not by a collision of muscles, but by a supreme geometry born within the intellect of General Epaminondas. Until then, the battlefields of Greece had been governed by a monotonous, planar aesthetic wherein phalanxes, dense walls of heavy hoplites, clashed head-on with uniform depth. Sparta had traditionally overwhelmed its enemies by stationing its most formidable elite on its right wing. Epaminondas shattered this fixed convention through cold, calculated mathematics. Against Sparta's supreme right wing, he concentrated his own left wing to an unprecedented depth of 50 ranks, placing the sacred band, Relentless, the elite of the elite, at its absolute vanguard. For the remaining right wing and center, he created the terrifying oblique phalanx, ordering them to advance at an angle delayed and refused at a distance from the enemy. The exact cadences formation was unleashed upon the plains of Leuctra. The unbroken right wing of Sparta was smashed to pieces, bones, and all by the hammer of Thebes. Overwhelming mass. King Cleombrotus of Sparta fell into the mud, and the Lacedaemonian hegemony that had endured for centuries vanished from the earth in a single day. 3. The March of the Titans, Pelopidas's northern advance and the consolidation of hegemony, 368 BCE. Following Leuctra, Thebes ceased to be a mere city-state, transforming into the absolute player governing the chessboard of Greece. While the legendary General Pelopidas marched his vanguard northward to contain the fluid undercurrents of Thessaly and the sudden grim vacuum of the Macedonian throne, the intellect of his lifelong ally, Epaminondas, remained unremittingly anchored to the Peloponnese. He had already executed his historic monumental invasion of that peninsula between 370 and 369 BCE, an immortal expedition that had permanently shattered Spartan hegemony by completely liberating the long-oppressed Messenian helots and constructing Megalopolis, in the heart of Arcadia, as a massive bulwark to encircle Sparta. Upon the sun-drenched training fields outside the capital, dust rose in twisting columns of smoke as Epaminondas scrutinized a new detachment of heavy hoplites. At 47 years of age, his face lacked the raw, battle-worn fatigue that defined Pelopidas, but it bore the profound logical lines carved by deep systemic thought. Beside him stood Lycomedes and Damocles, 2 seasoned commanders, conversing urgently about the supply logistics for the impending southern campaign. The harvest of Boeotia is abundant this year, General Epaminondas, Lycomedes muttered, his 40-year-old warrior's voice robust as he wiped the sweat from his shoulders. but the soil of the Peloponnese devours material faster than a pack of starving wolves. Have we truly completed the readiness required to execute a secondary long-term expedition into that theater? Epaminondas, tracking the micro-movements of his oblique phalanx with absolute focus, replied without shifting his gaze. His voice vibrated with the cold, calculated logic unique to a philosopher-statesman. Readiness, like Amedes, does not merely denote the abundance of grain or bronze. It signifies the possession of absolute structural certainty. The pride of Sparta has been pulverized. Yet the heart of that serpent still beats. They are frantically attempting to turn every city in the Peloponnese against the Boeotian League. He finally turned his head, a sharp, piercing light igniting within his pupils. Megalopolis requires our presence. The Messenians are emancipated, but their structural safety has not yet been permanently guaranteed. Damocles interjected, his tone sharp. The Athenians have hastily dispatched envoys into Arcadia, scattering seeds of friction. They parade beautiful rhetoric regarding ancient lineages and ancestral bonds, while conveniently forgetting their own historical betrayals. Epaminondas nodded slowly. Precisely. This secondary invasion is no mere campaign of conquest. It is an operation of absolute consolidation. We must demonstrate to the world that the hegemony of Thebes is no transitory phantom. We cannot permit a scenario where Sparta and Athens unite, bonding the entire southern theater into a singular front against our league. He paused, watching a shield wall lock into alignment. By stabilizing the southern matrix, we grant Pelopidas the strategic breathing room required to direct the great crisis of the north, Epaminondas continued. His voice carrying the prophetic cadence of a master architect overseeing a grand strategy. His hands are entirely full dealing with the tyrant Alexander of Pherai and the structural collapse of Macedonia. Every unsecured border craves a ruthless governing hand, for the true majesty of Thebes resides within the immense expanse of its influence. He paused for a fraction of a second, the image of his closest ally rising behind his retinas, a faint spark of warmth softening his eyes. And yet, I must candidly confess, when marching down these southern highways, I occasionally find myself missing his presence. Diplomacy in the Peloponnese frequently requires the devastating physical muscle of his fist, far more than the most eloquent speech. In that instant, a courier cut through the dust of the drilling field, dropping to his knees directly before Epaminondas. He presented a high-priority dispatch secured by the wax seal of General Epaminondas of Athens. Epaminondas accepted the document in silence. Breaking the wax, his eyes swiftly tracked the elegant, urgent script of the Athenian. The text detailed Queen Mother Eurydice's desperate plea for rescue, Athens' military inability to act, and most crucially, a highly refined geostrategic proposition. Demand the youngest prince, Philip, as a supreme hostage and tether Macedonia to the architecture of Theban order by isolating him within the Cadmea. The thin lips of Epaminondas twisted into a faint clinical smile, as if tracing a perfect geometric equation. Iphicrates, even in retirement, the man sketches an immaculate blueprint for a graft. What has been written, my lord? Damocles inquired. A summons from Macedon, Epaminondas murmured, calmly rolling the parchment back into its cylinder before handing it to his aide. And a perfect gift for my brother in arms. He looked toward the northern horizon. Have a copy of this cipher dispatched immediately to Pelopidas on the Thessalian front, though it is highly probable the couriers will cross paths along the highway. Iphicrates is a master of variables. He would have dispatched the identical text to Pelopidas simultaneously. That old Athenian gardener has calculated with absolute precision that our twin brains would derive the exact same mathematical conclusion from this matrix. Epaminondas's foresight was flawless. At that exact micro-negative second, deep within the freezing dark of a vanguard pavilion in Thessaly, General Pelopidas was staring at the identical letter from Iphicrates, delivered to his hand by the priest Chiron. Stationed in the north, Pelopidas sat with two documents laid flat before him. The regent Ptolemy's frantic plea for arbitration and Iphicrates' hostage proposition. Guided by his feral, predatory intuition, he had already verified his trajectory to victory. Now, in the south, Epaminondas had arrived at the exact same calculus. They would invite the young northern wolf cub, 14-year-old Philip, into the intellectual cage of Thebes. It was the ultimate systemic transplant, stripping Macedonia of its future, while systematically engineering the geometry of Boeotia directly into the boy's blood and bone. A solitary, monumental grand strategy was now in motion, locking its northern and southern cogs together in flawless alignment. In the north, Pelopidas acted as the swift, lethal edge of the League's blade, enduring blood-soaked friction against Macedonian factions and Thessalian tyrants to infuse absolute Theban influence into a volatile border. In the south, Epaminondas, the supreme tactical brain, orchestrated the permanent consolidation of Theban authority across the Peloponnese with clinical precision. This union of dual military geniuses served as the foundation for an absolute hegemony, the briefest yet most intensely concentrated dominion Greece had ever witnessed. Even as Pelopidas wrestled with the dark, suffocating intrigues of Pella, he understood with absolute clarity that he was an indispensable piece moving across a vast geostrategic grid. The scale of the game was Hellas itself, a ruthless arena where ambitions collided violently, and the sovereignty of entire city-states shifted with the velocity of a summer storm. The entire atmosphere of Greece vibrated with a raw, friction-filled tension, seeking a new equilibrium between an Athens desperate for resurrection, a Sparta brought to its knees, and the Persian Empire, permanently calculating its advantages from the deep shadows of the east. The funeral procession was a serpent of mourning winding across the valley floor. But as Pella's walls crested the horizon, the dirge dissolved into the wind, leaving only the crunch of boot leather on sun-baked dust and the grim, metallic clatter of the hoplite guard. Eurydice walked in the center. She had refused the litter. To be carried was to be a statue of grief, for the vultures of the Regency to gawk at. By walking, she denied them the sight of a broken woman. Her figure was swallowed by the dense, black wool of her mourning stola, yet she moved with measured, agonizing grace. She kneaded the earth beneath her feet to remind the city that she remained anchored to Macedonian soil, and that the Argead house, though bloodied, was not yet buried. As they drew closer, the city felt hollow, a carcass picked clean. The stone ramparts, usually imposing, resembled a cage. She could see Ptolemy's men on the battlements, watching the march with the eyes of jailers. Steady, she breathed. The command rippled through the guard. She was not just shielding the body of her son. She was a general conducting a final, desperate reconnaissance, her sharp eyes measuring the loyalties of a city she had helped rule 4 decades. Waiting at the threshold stood Ptolemy of Aluros. He wore the dark, sober robes of a man who understood the utility of grief. He did not bow. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture one of practiced deference that held the sharp edge of a challenge. As the bier-carrying Alexander II passed, Ptolemy's gaze lingered on the shroud. The boy was a brittle stick, he thought. Too much fire, not enough oil. He burned himself out before I could teach him to govern. He stepped forward, his voice a melodic baritone. The city is heavy with grief, Majesty. I have ensured the palace is prepared for the rites. Perhaps if you allowed me to handle the final arrangements, you might find a moment to recover. Recover? Ptolemy's thoughts were a flurry of cold, analytical motion. You mean vanish. You mean retreat to your chambers, while I tighten the noose around Perdiccas. You are a dangerous remnant, Eurydice, a ghost that refuses the grave. Eurydice did not look at him. She looked past him into the heart of the city. The arrangements are mine, Ptolemy. The Argead line is not a burden you can relieve me of. Ptolemy bowed deeper, his smile not reaching his eyes. Of course. I only wish to spare you the weight of this transition. The barons are restless. They look at this funeral and they see an empty chair. They look at the regency and they see uncertainty. They see blood, he thought. They see that the boy king is an easy mark, and they see that I am the only one holding the gates. You are the only thing standing between me and consolidation. I will be subtle, too much blood in one day will turn the city against me. But by the time these embers go cold, you will be a prisoner in your own house. The barons can look where they please, Eurydice said, her stride unbroken. But they would do well to remember that a gate left ajar is often a trap. Standing near the gate were the pillars of the court. Antipater stood rigid, gray eyes scanning for threats. Parmenion remained deathly still, his scarred hands reflecting a lifetime of service. Nearby, the elder Attalus stood with his arm around his nephew, young Attalus, whose eyes darted restlessly toward the city gates. Look at them, the younger Attalus whispered. The queen walks alone. She looks iron. That is not iron, boy, the elder Attalus gripped his shoulder. That is a woman who has forgotten how to be anything else. Parmenion watched with clinical detachment. She brings the body, but she carries the throne. Ptolemy is waiting inside. If they collide at the gate, the city will burn before the sun sets. Then we ensure they do not collide, Antipater muttered. He speaks of stewardship, Antipater thought, his heart cold. But there is no stewardship left in Pella. There is only the regency, Ptolemy's web, and the queen's pride. If I must choose between the spider or the ghost, I choose the one that keeps the borders secure. But God help us if the Athenian arrives and finds us in this state. Behind the bier, the remaining children walked in the wake of the queen. Perdiccas, the 17-year-old king, wore a hollow mask of exhaustion. Eurino clutched a small woven mourning doll, her eyes distant. And then there was Philip. He did not walk with his head bowed. He walked with his chin tilted up, his eyes sweeping the ramparts with the predatory precision of a hawk. The gate is already closing, Perdiccas whispered. Look at the guard, Philip. They aren't saluting. They're waiting. They're waiting for the signal to decide who the master is, Philip replied. Keep your stride, brother. If you stumble now, they'll have the excuse they need to carry you the rest of the way. They think I'm mourning, Philip thought, his pulse a steady rhythmic thrum of cold fury. I see a battlefield. Ptolemy has cleared the archers from the ramparts. He's showing us. He controls the reach. He thinks he's playing for the crown, but he's playing for a shallow grave. Will it ever be quiet again, Philip? Eurino whispered. Philip looked down at his sister, his expression softening for a heartbeat. When we reach the throne room, you stand behind Mother. Don't look at Ptolemy. Look at the people who look away when you pass. Those are the ones who are afraid. Survival is a peasant's ambition, Philip thought as the iron portcullis groaned overhead like a closing trap. I don't want to survive this house. I want to rebuild it from the foundation. Let the Regency sharpen their daggers. They are building a monument to their own vanity, and I am the spark that will turn it to ash. As they entered the courtyard, the gates slammed shut, a sound that vibrated in every chest. Philip straightened his spine. He walked into the dark heart of Pella, not like a mourner, but like an architect viewing a ruin he intended to claim. Before the palace steps, Ptolemy awaited the party. He did not bow, he offered an inspection. His eyes swept over the guards, his melodic baritone carrying across the square. The silence of the city is brittle, Majesty. It would take very little to shatter it. Perhaps if you allowed me to secure the perimeter before the rites, you might avoid a scene neither of us wishes to witness. Panic is a contagion, Ptolemy thought. If they see the queen looking anything less than supreme, the barons will smell the weakness. I need you to be invisible, Eurydice. The streets are my concern, Ptolemy, she replied, her gaze measuring the encroaching shadows. The Argead line is not a burden you can relieve me of, nor is it a spectacle for you to curate. Just as the regent opened his mouth to retort, the air was torn apart by frantic hoofbeats. A rider burst from an alleyway, his horse a lathered, heaving mass of misery. It skidded across the plaza before crashing down, throwing its rider at Eurydice's feet. My queen! The rider shrieked. The pass, Majesty? The narrow point at the gorge, the secure point has fallen. A ripple of primal, bone-deep panic surged through the lords. Lord Dirtis stepped forward, looming over the messenger. A full cohort holds that pass. They are veterans of the northern marches. They do not fall to mist and shadows. Who took it? Pausanias, the rider choked out. He emerged with the Illyrians and the disaffected. They held the high ground before we even knew they were there. The road is severed. We are cut off completely. Ptolemy's face drained of color. Pausanias. The name was a phantom that had haunted the bloodline for decades. In the annals of the Argead house, Amyntas was a prayer for stability. But Pausanias was a curse, the signature of the usurper who had once tried to tear the crown from Amyntas III's head in a night of shadowed steel. He isn't waiting for the funeral to end, Ptolemy thought, icy sweat tracing his jaw. He is striking just as Bartolus did 25 years ago. He was watching the first shadow return. 25 years ago, Bartolus had stalked them from Aegae, harassing their retreat until he cornered them at the gates of Pella, turning the city into a pyre. It was that night of ash that had forced Amyntas III into a lifelong terror, driving him to beg for external iron mercenaries like Iphicrates, just to keep the borders from dissolving. And now, the horror was looping back. Parmenion did not blink. He remembered the cloying, sweet stench of cedar and scorched flesh that had choked the valley a generation ago. The wolf is back at the door, he thought. Antipater remained frozen. If the gorge is gone, he realized, we aren't just blocked. We are sealed in a tomb. Beside them, the elder Attalus stood as if turned to stone, his hand clamping onto his nephew's shoulder. Young Attalus stood trembling. "Why are you shaking, uncle?" he hissed. "It's just a rebel. We have the walls." "You don't know," the elder Attalus whispered. "You didn't see the sky turn orange. You didn't hear the silence that follows when a city is wiped from the map." Philip stepped forward, eyes gleaming with a manic clarity. He had heard the stories, but they had always felt like dry, ancient parchment. Seeing the terror etched into the faces of the men who had lived through it, he realized the past was not dead. It was simply waiting. Pausanias is here, Philip thought, his blood singing with the cold thrill of the battlefield. He doesn't want to debate legitimacy in the halls, he wants to carve it out of our chests in the gorge. "He severed the road," Philip announced, his voice ringing with the authority of a general. "He is counting on your cowardice, Regent. He wants the gates wide open for his next strike." Antipater stepped beside the prince. "The gorge is the throat of the kingdom," he thought. "If Ptolemy sends the guards to clear it, he leaves the king defenseless. If he stays, he loses the army and his legitimacy. It is a masterstroke of a madman." Parmenion spoke, his voice gravelly. "Pausanias is a scavenger. He waits for the lion to die, then bites the neck. He thinks this funeral is the end of us. He doesn't realize he's just walked into a hornet's nest." Eurydice turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Ptolemy's. "Ptolemy," she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal resonance. "Your stability has lasted exactly as long as the funeral march. You are standing here shivering behind nothing but your robes and your fear." She looked at Philip, and in the boy's eyes she saw not fear, only a terrifying, cold reflection of her own resolve. She had sent him to Thebes to shield him from this collapse. She had reached out to Iphicrates, the Athenian general, not to save Pella, but to secure a future for her surviving children, once the walls inevitably crumbled. But those plans were for a world that no longer existed. "Close the inner gates," she commanded, the Queen Mother's authority reclaiming the air. "Bar the palace. If Pausanias wants the throne, let him come and take it from the fire." As the guards scrambled to obey, the silence was shattered. From the north, a deep, rhythmic thunder began to vibrate through the paving stones, the drums of Pausanias' army echoing from the gorge. She realized with a bitter clarity that she had banked on an Athenian rescue that would arrive too late, for a city that had already signed its own death warrant. The funeral had ended, the war for the Argead legacy had begun. To be continued in episode 25, Summons of Thessaly and Macedon. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.